So for a number of years, I've taught the Predictioneers model, which is a forecasting technique developed by Bruce Bueno de Mesquita. And I've used the example of Russia's seizure of Crimea in 2014 to illustrate sort of how this model can be used for prediction. And in my video where I talk about this, I highlight how this model did better than my own sort of gut analysis, even though I was fairly systematic in making forecasts back in 2014. And so I'd like to kind of talk through how I've updated this model to reflect kind of where I think we are at in Ukraine, to kind of get a sense of maybe where this model points us for what might be in store in the future. And so just a quick refresher on the Predictioneers model. Bruce Bueno de Mesquita thinks that you identify the actors who are potentially involved. You identify their salience. How much does this matter for each of the actors? He also sometimes talks about sort of how much attention they have to pay to things. I'm going to set that aside. And we assign a number. I use a 0 to 100 scale, but you can use whatever scale you want as long as you're more or less consistent. And back in 2014, I thought that the Russia-Ukraine Crimea crisis was probably the most important thing for Russia and was probably the most important thing for Ukraine, putting them both at 100. But then it wasn't the most important thing for the West. I gave them a 10. Those numbers are kind of arbitrary, and it's always something that's always made me uncomfortable with Bueno de Mesquita's approach. And so I've modified it with this Excel sheet in which I also give myself sort of a level of confidence around those predictions. And then I can generate a random number that gets multiplied by that and will adjust those numbers to reflect that I have some certainty. And any one of those adjustments doesn't necessarily matter, but every time I click somewhere in Excel, Excel generates a new random number and gives me a slightly altered prediction. And I actually wrote an algorithm to take that process and repeat it 1,000 times so you can get a sense of, so I have this uncertainty. Things could land higher than I expect or lower than I expect. How do I deal with that? Okay, so that's what the Excel sheet is doing. Second thing that Bruce Bueno de Mesquita says that he thinks matters is the influence. How, if you think about this as like a tug of war, how much can you sort of pull on the rope and pull things in your direction? You can think about it as power, but I think power has a slightly different definition here. It's your salience, how much you care, times your influence. But for influence, initially I said Russia was probably 80. The powerful state care a lot about it, or the powerful state has a lot of resources. The West has a lot of resources as well, but isn't necessarily in as good a position to use those in Ukraine. And then Ukraine is fairly weak relative to Russia. And again, my numbers are semi-arbitrary, but I think we can adjust for that with our confidence levels. And then I said the ideal points for what countries want to kind of make sense of what that is. I think I need to jump to, of course, I lost my slide. This scale where I sort of put all of the sort of possible outcomes on a continuum and space them between sort of Russia's ideal point and Ukraine's ideal point, sort of the two opposite poles. And so I said 100 is Russia gets all of Ukraine. 0, Ukraine becomes a full member of NATO, and there's a whole range of things that happen in between. And so at that point, I was predicting that Russia wanted all of Ukraine. It didn't mean it would get it, just that would be the ideal outcome for Russia. Ukraine probably wanted to be in NATO at that particular moment, but the West wasn't necessarily sure if it wanted Ukraine in NATO. Maybe independent, aligned with the West, maybe in the EU, but probably not, was where the West wanted things to be in 2014. I've actually adjusted that a little bit, and I think things have shifted fairly significantly. I think the issue is still the top thing for Russia right now. It's the top thing for Ukraine, but this is the crisis that has galvanized the West. NATO is suddenly like re-engaging in this question of security in Europe. And so I think we've seen the salience jump significantly for the West. I'm not 100% sure on my calculation for that. So I put a little bit of a wiggle room on my confidence on that. For influence, I think Russia retains a lot of influence. I think the West's influence has actually gone down. There's lots of talk about how Russia has hardened their economy to protect against sanctions. I think that's true, but I'm not entirely sure. Actually, I'm going to change this one up in real time. I'm going to bump this up to 10 because I was watching some reports come in that maybe Russia was sending conscripts into Ukraine rather than their battle-hardened troops, and so maybe they won't perform quite as well as expected. And then Ukraine, I think, has actually gained an influence. They've had, 7 or 8 years of training and hardware coming in from the West. I think they might be in a better position to resist Russia than they were in 2014. But again, I've got sort of a range of confidence around that. I'm not entirely sure. And then finally, I think the ideal points have remained maybe pretty similar. I'm not sure that the West necessarily wants a Ukraine entering into NATO or into the European Union if it continues to have sort of territorial disputes, if there continue to be Russian troops on its borders, if there continues to be a low burning civil war, that may change. So this is sort of my forecast of where things are kind of at right now. I do think we do need to look at these ideal points and adjust some things because the world has changed from 2014. I still think Russia's ideal point is to get all of Ukraine. I still think Ukraine's ideal point is to become a full member of NATO. I think the West still wants Ukraine to have policy autonomy and to be aligned with the West. But I think because events have sort of shifted a little bit and what we're talking about is a little bit different, I wanted to shift that 85 and 65 point. 85 now, as I think Russia gets to control Ukraine as a puppet state. It doesn't become part of Ukraine, of Russia's territory, but it ends up functioning like Belarus, where it's essentially politically joined at the hip to Russia and is in a subservient position to Russia. I think another outcome is that Russia nominally is in control of Ukraine. It nominally has taken the country, it is occupied, but that occupation is not secure. This would be your ongoing insurgency kind of outcome. 50 would be a partition. Russia takes maybe the east, there's a rump state in the west that we see emerging. And then 30, Ukraine wins and defeats Russia, and Russia pulls back and we get full autonomy for Ukraine. So I kind of adjusted my forecasts. I think these are fair calculations, but I'm not 100% sure. And so I am going to, this is actually the first time I'm running this. I don't know where this is going to land. I'm going to go through and just run this. And so what it's doing is it's multiplying the salience for each actor times their influence to get a score adjusted for the randomness component to get a power score for each actor. And then the power score is for each actor is multiplied by the ideal point for each actor. And then those are sort of added up, those multiplications of ideal points and power. And then it's divided by the total amount of power that is shown there in that box, sort of on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side, that total power number. And it gets a prediction. And so what the flickering of Excel is doing right now is it's taking those predictions that are in sheet 1 and it's picking them up and dropping them into sheet 2 and just store them, and then coming back to sheet 1 and calculating another prediction. And so it'll run for just another second here. And when it finishes up, we'll be able to get a sense of, given the uncertainty around these numbers, and they are a little bit arbitrary, and we try to build in some of that uncertainty, what's sort of the range of what we might see, what's sort of the most optimistic scenario for Ukraine, what's the most pessimistic scenario for Ukraine, and then what's sort of the average prediction to get a sense of how things sort of landed, taking into account that uncertainty that we have. You might have noticed that I'm a little bit less animated today about this. This crisis has really hit me hard. And heart goes out to the people of Ukraine. Okay, so the minimum prediction is 51, the maximum prediction is 70, and the average prediction is 61. And so shifting that into our new scale, 61 would be Russia's losing influence over Ukraine, at least the western part of Ukraine, because of an insurgency. I would say this points to a protracted insurgency. The most optimistic outcome for Ukraine, the 50, is partition, that they lose the east, they get to keep the west. And the most pessimistic outcome for Ukraine is a protracted insurgency that's losing, that Russia is able to squash. I am very concerned about this prediction, and I will say, based on Russia's experience conducting counterinsurgency in Chechnya, counterinsurgency is going to look a heck of a lot more like what we saw in Syria than what we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's not going to be a hearts and minds campaign. It will most likely be barbarism, where cities are sieged, populations are starved, civilians are shelled. That's a horrific outcome. Even the most optimistic outcome of 50 partitioning Ukraine would be cataclysmic. One of the things that happens when you get these kind of partitions is ethnic cleansing. Sometimes it's voluntary. Sometimes people are, just I have to get out. I'm Ukrainian. I'm on the wrong side of the river, or I'm Russian and on the west side. I have to get to the Russian territory. But there are areas that are maybe in dispute, neighborhoods that are in dispute, and you can get very violent ethnic cleansing at the neighborhood level in those situations. And so I don't have a lot of optimism at this particular moment. I hope that the forecast is wrong. I hope that there's something I haven't taken into consideration. I may be revisiting this and updating it as events on the ground change. But right now, based on the model, based on where I think things are at, this is where I'm anticipating will land.